Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
So one thing I think we're consistently hitting on here on the High Rise is looking at the data. And when we look at sales data, I think a common thing we've talked about in a number of episodes is that it's all about access. It's like when you find out that there are more stores, you see more sales happening. And if there's not enough stores, the sales slow down. Sometimes there's also this kind of curve where you get a lot of stores and maybe saturation of stores, but that saturation may be concentrated in areas, right? So even though you kind of hit this supply demand curve where sales kind of peter out and you have a lot of stores, I think there's still opportunity to be had. It's just that there's a lot of prohibition yet in legal markets in local jurisdictions. So what was it pretty interesting last week, and what I want to talk about today, Emily, is this Leafly opt-out report, where they basically kind of took this idea and turned it into a 20-page report on what it means when jurisdictions opt out.
Yeah, I thought this report was really interesting, especially because we're entering into a time where more states are potentially going to legalize and they have an opportunity to roll out their programs. So it's really important to understand the downstream effect of having these quote unquote dry jurisdictions. And I think your point earlier is the point I'm always trying to drive home, which is that I don't think we have a supply demand imbalance in these markets where supply is totally outpacing demand. I think the access is underserving the demand. So we still have a lot of upside opportunity, even in the more quote unquote mature markets such as California Oregon has, to your point, it's like clustering of retail, not necessarily well dispersed. So you're reaching a per capita solution there. But I think that we have a ways to go in terms of getting the access points right for the consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. One of these, like Oregon, I remember last year, a lot about Ontario and Toronto and like Queen Street West, where there's all sorts of cannabis retailers that popped up and everyone says, oh, there's a saturation, there's just too many. But, just on this one street, right? If you took those retailers and you distributed them across the province, I think you'd find out that sales would keep climbing. And so that's what this is kind of talking about. And these jurisdictions are opting out of legal cannabis because the premise of this report is that the local leaders assume that it will keep cannabis out of their community, right? So this idea of like, well, we don't want any stores, then obviously there'll be no cannabis. And this is the thing we always complain about, right? You never see it on Main Street. You always see it in the industrial areas of cities when it is available. You have to really go out of your way often, right? So this report kind of covers that from a sense of, the different states. And I thought we could maybe dive into some of the data here. This is pretty interesting. They highlighted a number of different states, and probably the one maybe where we should start is the largest market of California. And again, nothing new to anybody who's listened to this podcast. We've talked about this before when California is signaled that they're going to be issuing more licenses, that's good. And when they've done that, it's in a lot of these markets. But this report basically says that 55% of California sales are in the illicit market is their estimation. And it kind of like that, kind of begged the question of like, well, how are they getting this illicit market data? And, I kind of scrubbed through it and actually sent an email in to Bruce Barcott, one of the authors of this report. And he mentioned the other author, Bo Whitney, who we've worked with at Headset in the past. And Bo has this total market estimation metric. It's in the methodology section. You can kind of read about it, but it's something to do with an assumption around 1/3 of the adult population has consumed cannabis at least once in the past year. And somehow they're backing into maybe on a per capita basis, the number of consumers that might be out there versus what is available in the legal markets as far as sales numbers. So in California, they plugged 55% illicit and 45% legal. And we obviously know that there's a massive illicit market in California, just anecdotally. But, seeing these kind of numbers, if these net out, I pulled some Headset sales data for 2022 year to date. So, this is the tail end of September. We're not month in, but this does include basically 3 weeks and some change of September. Like 70% of the year, 73% of the year, I think we've gone through already, which is crazy on a separate subject that we're closing in on 23 already. But when I looked at year to date sales, it's about 6.4 billion year to date California. And this is pre-tax, post-discount sales. So if you take that and you say, okay, well, this is 45% of legal sales. So 55% is illicit, and you roll in that illicit, assuming, that they're in the legal market, that would give us a year-to-date number of 7.6 billion. So that's, in this assumption that there are a perfect amount of stores for people and no one is buying illicit anymore because, it just doesn't exist. Well, we would have made 7.6 billion year to date. And when we, extrapolate that out for the full year, just kind of assuming, given we're 3/4 of the way through, it's about a $10.5 billion market for 2022, which is a bit larger than what we've predicted for like 2025 revenue targets for California. But obviously, we also don't assume that there'll be 100% coverage by then. But that's a big number, $10 billion.
It's a significant number. And I think that I question whether or not that's actually the spot on number for California, because I actually think the illicit market activity with consumers is higher than that, just because we have a lot of these illegal delivery companies as well as illegal retailers that still exist, especially in markets like Los Angeles. Not so much in San Francisco. That's highly dependent upon the local jurisdiction, but I think that there's a lot of illegal transactions going on with consumers. So I think it probably skews a little bit higher. And I think that what's interesting is when I look at that data, I think about the illicit market of California operators that are not legal and have not paid to participate in the legal market, distributing their product through to the consumer in various forms and fashions. We've mentioned those like burner distros, but I think the other side to this is when you look at the illicit market activity of the eastern states, a lot of that product is coming from the Oregons, the California markets. And so it's interesting because this goes from like a hyper local issue of like jurisdiction to jurisdiction dry zones to also the broader market perspective of inter and intrastate commerce. So it's just something that I was struck by when I was looking at this data, but or these data, I should say. But this was a really compelling report to me. I thought it was really thoughtfully assembled, and I think you articulated it when we were prepping for it, that this could be a resource for people who are looking to push reform forward, because it substantially points to what we've all been trying to get at by legalizing and regulating cannabis, which is that it helps to pull activity out of the illicit market. By the way, I think people have heard of the Cole Memo, which was our original banking guidelines. And there's a great interview with our friend Seth with James Cole, and he talks about how that was one of his sole purposes of creating a framework around this, is when he saw cartels suffering at the hands of legalization and illicit market operators suffering at the hands of legalization, then he knew it was working. And I think that that's a pretty compelling thing. And it's a massive rhyme to alcohol prohibition, where you saw the mafia activity around distributing alcohol during prohibition, and then what happened not so far after. But just a couple of other things that stood out to me. For example, New Jersey gets noted for 71% of their local municipalities opted out. Now, New Jersey is a brand new market, and I know that a lot of the knee-jerk reaction by regulators is to opt out of the program for exactly the reasons Sai said. But there's also this interesting conundrum when they're doing this, which is if you don't opt out before the program's enacted, you can't opt out after. So a lot of the states will see this happen before the market opens, because the regulators are just too afraid to open with an adult use market. And so the knee jerk is to opt out. And then they start to get enticed. And we have seen the jurisdictions who realize that they're leaving A, revenue on the table, and B, they're not also actually curtailing illicit market activity by not having it available. And some of the state regulations have tried to create incentives to participate. For example, tax revenue generated from the cannabis industry in California only benefits jurisdictions that have legal and regulated open markets. And so they tried to create some incentives there to participate in it. It's just interesting. So I feel like New Jersey stuck out for having such a high percentage of opt-outs, but it's still early days, and hopefully they'll pay attention to why it's beneficial to opt in.
Yeah, New Jersey had 70% of jurisdictions opting out. I remember reading a report when this first came around last year that it's not 70% of the population either. I think it's a lot of small towns that opted out. They have a whole section, a carve out in the report on New Jersey. It's pretty interesting where they look at drive time. They get some data around what people are willing to drive, and it's roughly 10 minutes to drive to a dispensary or a cannabis retailer, and 5 minutes at the gas station, 20 minutes to go see a movie. So they said, okay, well, within 10-minute drive of the 3 licensed retailers in New Jersey as of July 2022, it's basically 90% of southern New Jersey is like out of range, more or less. I mean, you could drive more than 10 minutes, sure, but that's kind of how they plotted this. So pretty interesting. And you mentioned, how getting this information to leaders and hopefully the jurisdiction so they can reevaluate, I think is a big piece of this. And there's like 4 or 5 pages of this report just dedicated to the benefits of enabling legal cannabis. And again, no surprise to anybody that's probably listening, but they talk about, illegal products are a risk to public health. And we've talked about, the vape gate issue, where all the illicit product that, like legit, like killed people was illicit market, right? Stuff, unregulated market. They talk about teen use does not increase. We've seen all sorts of stats and surveys that report that, teen use does not go up. Minimum age laws are effective, and they talk about that, like blocking people from coming in, carding you. They every time I go, I get carded, multiple times, and they're saying it's basically 100% effective.
Me too. As much as I like to be flattered that I look young, I just know they're doing a thorough job of checking, which is
This means you
good.
get to say it multiple times, right? Oh, it's so flattering.
Oh, sigh. Okay.
I do it too. I do too.
No,
Opting
it's good.
in creates jobs and saves taxpayer dollars. So there's that too. And there's a quote in here from Hirsch Jane of California. I think it's pretty good. Voters have lost their patience, he says. They might be willing to cut their elected officials some slack, but after a while, they're going to take matters into their own hands. So I think that, they're the residents of these jurisdictions that see this kind of ridiculousness. And, this is where getting involved in like kind of your local politics, I think, can help. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. You can file it in the obvious category. Like, yeah, oh, obviously, right? You open stores, illicit market sales go down. But, we're still in this world where there are so many jurisdictions that still blanket prohibit it because they, for whatever reason are terrified that teen usage is going to go up or people are going to get sick or, all these things that we know are positives aren't going to happen. So hopefully this can change some hearts and minds and give people some data to point to maybe bring to those town council meetings to say, look, this is actually probably a good thing for us. Not to mention the job creation, especially in like this kind of economic climate that we're in. Hopefully they'll come to their senses. I know that, Leafly has done a really good job with the jobs report. I see that float around quite a bit on, how many jobs does legal cannabis bring to the US? I don't know where that gets cited, but I know that it must get cited, right? It must get passed around out there. So hopefully this is kind of on that level of, hey, this is a new report. This is, if you're not thinking about it, because, you're in a small town or a county or a large county or whatever, it's not something you're thinking about every day. Now this crosses your desk. Maybe it triggers like, okay, we should probably have this conversation. Maybe if you're, a resident of these markets, you see, or these regions, you see this and you say, hey, this is crazy that we don't have access. And yeah, I don't want to drive more than 10 minutes and I shouldn't have to drive more than 10 minutes. So hopefully this, changes. It doesn't hurt for sure. And maybe this will start to become like the jobs report, where they do this every year. And it would be great if they did to see, has this changed? And I know California has been working towards that and getting more licenses on Main Street in areas that, have had, prohibition. So maybe maybe this will just accelerate all of that work.
Yeah, and just to give you like one anecdote of what this could look like from a business perspective, Fresno was one of the slower jurisdictions to open in California, and it's a massive kind of urban sprawl area of the state. And really right in the breadbasket. But the stores that finally opened this year are on a run rate to do over $10 million each. And some are more around 18. Can you imagine? I mean, that's revenue that could have existed and tax paying entities that could have existed in the state for the last 3 years. And not to mention, to your point, employing individuals locally. Mm-hmm.
And that 10 million is not a bunch of new consumers coming into the category, by the way. I don't have the data to show that, but for sure, just anecdotally, it's not the people that have never tried it. This is people that are coming from the illicit market in a big way. Obviously, there's going to be some new people in there, but it is the core consumer, right, that's coming in that was transitioning from the illicit to the legal market. So that's a great data point. Well, as more stores open up, apart from just, helping out all these local jurisdictions with tax revenue and converting more of the illicit market to the legal market, it just means more people get to card you, Emily.
It means more people get to card me. It means more people get to interact with new product categories and understanding cannabis better. Because let's face it, this is still it's an industry that has a lot of educating to do. So the in-person shopping experience is made better by having, people who are knowledgeable in branded products kind of leading the charge there. So I'm excited to see some of this happening. I think California is continuing to see some of these jurisdictions open up, and I have faith that it will happen in other markets. And yes, I can get carded, and my youth obsession can get validated repeatedly.
That doesn't hurt.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.